how you came to work at Channel 3, how that happened.
I came to work at Channel 3. I was writing for the Des Moines Register, and one of the reporters from Channel 3, and there weren't very many at that time, was going to leave, and they asked me if I would fill in and do a few things that ever happened in Council Bluffs for them. And I said yes, and did that for several months, and just sort of evolved into about 35 years. That's the way that whole thing happened.
And that was in mid-50s?
That was, gosh, I'd have to really look it up. I think it was in late 1956 when I first came over here.
The year I was born. Sorry. Well, you had to be, the only lady in the building, maybe other than a couple of secretaries.
Right. There were no women in television, but then at that time, we're talking about just 7 years after the two stations went on the air. It was all brand new, and there weren't any women in television right at that time. And of course, that soon followed, but at that time there weren't. As television news.
What was television news like then at Channel 3? In the early or mid-50s.
Television news when I first got in, and probably for the first 10 or 15 years, was wonderful because we did things that you didn't even know you could do, or we did things that were so good in those days that, and we just took it that we knew how to do it. One of the reasons for that was that Floyd Calber, who was the anchor and the news director, expected the impossible. And that's the way it was. He'd send you to do something, and whether you thought you could do it or not, you'd say, oh, well, we can't do that. That's your assignment. And somehow we did it. And he was very strict about ethics. He was very strict about balance. And we toed the mark for him and for ourselves. We got a great reputation in those days because of that.
I was just going to ask you that Channel 3 News always had a reputation for those very things. And is that due to Floyd? Is it his credit?
I think it was a lot due to his credit, plus, and to his credit that he hired people like Marketeer, Dick Trimbath, all those first people, Galen Lilithorpe, who came in, and they were people of high ethical standards, and they understood what news was supposed to be. That's how we built the reputation, and we did have a fine reputation, as I'm sure you do now, but then we were so new that it was nice to have a good reputation.
And being in Omaha, the network really depended on this station a lot, didn't it?
It did. I remember when I first came over there, there was a terrible rest home fire in Council Bluffs. There were 19 people, elderly patients, who were killed in their beds. And I remember the night that happened, and for the next 2 days, and we had all 3 networks calling us to do tapes, or not tapes then, film, and all 3 networks were calling us and wanting us to do things for them, which was pretty unusual, pretty complimentary to us.
You developed a pretty personal relationship, too, with the May family, didn't you?
Yes, all of the Mays, and, people who worked for the Mays developed a good relationship with the entire family. And it was a very family-oriented business. They had their, they were in the seed business in Shenandoah, and they had a radio station down there. And they transplanted all of that hominess right up to Omaha. And a Owen Sadler was the head of KMTV, and he was a wonderful man and very news-minded. And, you know, in those days, everything cost a bundle to make improvements. But the May family and Owen always backed that. You know, if that's what it took to put a good product on the air, you eventually got it. It's still very expensive to put a good product on the air.
It just seems so, it has always seemed so odd to me, you know, that a family that was in the garden business just had this dream to get into the technology of TV and could do it.
But that went back to the grandfather. The grandfather was, you know, he was the first one who decided you ought to have early morning broadcasts on radio. That's when the farmers were out there doing their work. I mean, he was very innovative. And Ed Jr. came up that way, and Eddie Jr., who was now Ed May, was that way too. They were very, very into the whole picture of television.
How do you think Mark and Floyd would view television news today the same way? I mean, were they really similar in their beliefs?
I think Mark Gutierrez had a wonderful basic morality about him, and it spilled over into when he was news director, and he learned that from Floyd Calber, who was the same way about the news. And I think the fact that they really wanted everything perfect before it went on the air. They wanted you to have checked everything 10 ways from Sunday before you put it on the air. And I think that's what built KMTV's early reputation that went on for many years.
I remember when Mark interviewed me in the conference room of the old building down on Farnham, and I was a junior in college, and there were two requirements, he said. I had to have my own car, and I did. And he said, don't ask for any time off.
That's right.
Don't ask me for Saturday night off for a date. Are you in a sorority? Yes. Don't ask off for your meetings. Don't ask off. He just put the fear of God in me.
Yeah.
And he walked past me, and I'd tremble. But I think I learned a lot of valuable lessons.
Oh, yes. Mark, I think, was a great teacher for everybody, and so was Floyd. But then Floyd left, and Jim Roberts became news director, and then Mark. And Mark was 20 years, you know, as a news director. And I just think people who trained under Mark, boy, they had a leg up on the business.
I think so too. And you talk about KMTV reputation for news and everything. I think another thing, as you go back and look in the history of all the projects the station was involved in, like MDA is getting ready to go again, and how 30 years the station's been doing that telethon, and there was the golf tournament every year. And it's like Channel 3 was always providing some kind of service to the community.
Right.
It wasn't just broadcaster, it was...
And you know, one of the very first service to the community things that KMTV did was when we had the Sabin Oral Sunday. And it was at the time when polio was so bad. And this wonderful vaccine came out that people could be inoculated. And it was very important to get it going and get every kid especially, and right away. And KMTV went into that program and had a special Sunday where every school kid was taken to their school to get the inoculation. We were nominated for an Emmy for that effort, and it was, you know, that was sort of the beginning of doing wonderful community work, which they always have done.
I wasn't going to ask you about covering Starkweather and Fugate, but since everybody in the
Really?
whole building, I'm just going to ask you one, since everybody in the whole building says, oh, I saw you on A&E, would you consider that to be the biggest story of your career?
I guess that I would consider the Starkweather Fugate story to be probably one of the biggest stories the station has ever covered, and the way we covered it. And as far as me personally, it probably was, at least it's the longest lasting story. It will follow me to my grave and beyond, apparently. And it has been a very interesting story.
Was that especially when you had the opportunity to interview Carol Fugate, was that just a case of being in the right place at the right time, or was that a good example of just working the story till you got it?
I think it was an example of working the story until we got it, but mostly it was because we gained the confidence of the lawyers and the people we were working with, and they had a great deal of confidence that they may not like what came out on the story, but they knew we would be fair. They may think we weren't fair from their point, but when they thought about it, they knew we were doing a fair job of covering that story.
You know, Ninette, it's so interesting you say that, because I try to tell that to new people, like, not Roger, some of these young folks that come in and get frustrated or whatever, and I tell Howard Kennedy one time told me that he thought that our business is all about relationships, and you can be the best doggone reporter in the whole wide world, but if you don't have a relationship with that police detective or that school superintendent or somebody else, they don't trust you.
And you know what? They don't have a lot of time to make up their minds on stories, whether they trust you. So if they have watched you or watched the way you do the news, they have a little bit of a feeling about it. And when you come in, if you have a rapport with them and the trust, they'll do things for you. And you, in return, are fair in reporting your stories.
You know, does anything else stand out? Obviously, the nursing home fire, you mentioned that, and, of course, the Starkweather story. And when you work at TV for 35 years, how the heck do you remember anything, you know?
Yeah, that's right. Nothing in, you know.
Nothing in particular.
And there were so many, you know.
Do you think that it was to your advantage, you know, being a young woman in the late 50s, being in the television business, or was that maybe was it harder, or did it matter?
You know, I don't think it ever mattered, but then I never thought it was a big deal for women to do anything. I just thought women could do whatever. I think my grandmother thought that. I know my mother thought that. I was raised to think that. And so, you know, people would think that was really great that I could do something in television when there weren't any other women. But, I was just doing something I knew how to do. Not too well, by the way, when I started, but you do learn the longer you're around.
Anything else you want to say about Floyd?
I can't think of anything because, you know, I said...
He'd be so flattered by what you said.
Yeah, he should be. Dirty dog. He gave me plenty of...
Yeah.
Look at Carrie when you answer it, obviously. What did you learn about yourself or life or other people in 35 years of news?
What I think I learned about life and people and relationships in relation to my business in news is that you have to treat everybody like you'd like to be treated. And you have to get your facts, and you have to really be sure of every word you're putting out on the air. You have to be sure it's right. And everybody can make a mistake, but you don't make very many.